Hello everyone, and welcome back to the channel for another video. A couple days ago I uploaded my top 15 best films of 2024. Planned on recording this one soon after, but of course I got sick again. It's been happening constantly lately. I expect that this video will go by a little bit quicker than my top 15 best because, number one, I don't like dwelling on negativity for more long than necessary. This is basically just a warning of what films from last year to avoid watching unless you're, for whatever reason, still interested in them after hearing what I have to say about them. But also, I wasn't willing to go back and rewatch all of these to think of enough talking points, so some of them I struggled to remember everything that happened because, well, let's be real, a lot of bad movies are forgettable, but I was able to recall enough, and there might be some mild spoilers for the films that I talk about. I'm not including any honorable mentions in this video because I don't really think it's necessary. Keep in mind, though, I did see well over 90 films that came out last year, and there were quite a few bad movies, I'm going to be honest. So I'll warn you right now, The Crow, Argyle, Megalopolis, those are 3 bad movies that I am shocked did not make the list today, but they didn't. And just because they aren't on the list doesn't mean I think they're good films. With that said, I would encourage you to drop down into the comments at some point while watching the video and let me know what you think the worst films of last year were. Number 15, Venom: The Last Dance. Sorry, I know these movies have a pretty sizable fan base, but come on, man, this was the worst one and a huge disappointment as far as the final chapter in a trilogy goes. Aside from the third act, which at least delivers on some symbiote insanity, it's just such a nothing burger. There's no real character development. At no point during this movie did I go, all right, this is the chapter I was waiting for. This is what makes it necessary for us to get a Venom trilogy in which we follow him as a standalone character with no Spider-Man, no other characters of note really. As entertaining as I find Tom Hardy to be in this role, I think this third film just really cemented to me the idea that this entire trilogy and this entire Sony Spider universe was totally pointless. Number 14, Y2K. This is an egregious waste of a fun concept, a movie so trapped in its nostalgic beats that it does nothing but say, oh, look at this, look at that. Recognize this from the 90s? How about that? It becomes so focused on this time capsule element that it completely forgets how to have half-decent characters or a half-decent plot. So instead we get these paper-thin dollar store versions of super bad characters with hardly any personality. It makes these actors into such vapid, paper-thin people. It has a few bursts of entertaining sequences, like when the computers first come alive and kill a few kids in pretty gruesome fashion. I was like, okay, the movie's finally picking up. And then the computers disappear for a while, and it turns into a half hour or so of watching these kids wander around in the woods. This movie has a severe identity crisis. It can't decide what it wants to be. Horror, comedy, post-apocalyptic thriller. It's just so all over the place, and ultimately I found it to be one of the most forgettable theater experiences of the year. Number 13, Drive Away Dolls. This is a horrifically unfunny road trip comedy in which every joke is somehow related to sex toys, lesbian stereotypes, pretty much any low-hanging fruit that you can possibly think of. So if to you dildos are the most hysterical thing on earth, here's your movie. I promise you there are plenty of dildo jokes in here. I had fairly high expectations for this one too, and it was just such a huge letdown. I love Margaret Qualley too, but Jesus, that southern accent was a bit much. I get that this is a comedy and not meant to be taken too seriously, but my God, the villains, they're like the Three Stooges. It was so goofy and frantic that I found it impossible to take any of it seriously. And generally speaking, I like the Coen brothers. Clearly, they're a duo that needs to stay together to capture lightning in a bottle. Ethan on his own kind of fell off. Number 12, Red One. I liked Krampus, I guess? You know the drill. The Rock gets to be The Rock. Chris Evans needs to fire his agent because my God, does he get a lot of terrible roles lately. I guess I'll give this movie some credit for doing one or two interesting things with Christmas lore, so to speak, but it does everything in a way that just pisses me off. It's as if they took ideas that could possibly work with a more creative writing team, but then they made the screenplay completely with ChatGPT. And then they had AI do the VFX while they were at it. This just screams airplane fodder for children who have the attention span of a fly. I think that's the only target audience that will get anything out of this junk food. Number 11, Rebel Moon Part 2, The Scargiver. Zach, how did you screw up this bad? Twice! The whole first movie was meant to be a setup for this, And I mean, the first one was bad enough, but Jesus, I didn't know that part 2 was going to be Wheat Farming Simulator, the movie. If you haven't seen it, I'm not joking. They harvest wheat in slow motion in this film. Not everything needs to be slow-mo, Zach. I don't know if he's ever going to learn this. The first film was a build-up and introduction to all of these misfit characters all coming together to face these Imperial forces, and this film does eventually give you a big final battle at the end, but holy shit, the first 2 hours or so are just agonizing to sit through. And it doesn't matter how good Zack Snyder is as a visual storyteller. I do like his direction style sometimes, but he needs to find somebody else to write his screenplays. That's the bottom line. The wasted potential with this IP really hurts because I like the idea of more original sci-fi, but this was boring as fuck and just failed to engage me at all. Number 10, Mean Girls. Now, why does this even exist? Just why? I haven't seen Mean Girls on Broadway, and maybe it's good, but why can't we just let theater be theater and cinema be cinema? They aren't the same thing, which is why Mean Girls the musical was originally adapted from the film version in the first place. Don't adapt it backwards. Don't reverse engineer this shit. The songs just add nothing for me. And it's especially uncanny that some of the actors, like Tina Fey, reprise their roles from the original film. Meanwhile, others are new faces. I see no reason to make this film other than to make a quick buck, and I don't even know if it was a financial success. Anyways, hate's a strong word, but sorry guys, I kinda hated this one. Number 9, Tarot. Trevor Henderson, I'm so sorry, man. You illustrated some truly epic monster designs only for them to be tarnished by this awful, occasionally funny horror film. God, it's all just so predictable. A bunch of kids get together and play a deadly game with tarot cards and become cursed, and as you can probably predict, they get picked off one by one. And it's just so painfully obvious when someone is about to die, when it's their turn and their card has been picked, and there's never any suspense as to whether or not they're going to make a smart decision to get out of the situation, because every single character in this movie is a complete moron. They make the worst choices, because the screenwriters clearly have zero integrity to write characters that we can actually take seriously. So there's zero suspense, a bunch of wacky attempts at humor that feel oddly misplaced. I think at a certain point I started rooting for the evil. Number 8, The Strangers Chapter 1. Ah, The Strangers, a horror franchise that never should have been a franchise in the first place. I'll say this, I think Prey at Night has some redeeming qualities as a sequel, but this is just a blatant retread of the first film with not one single major deviation. I thought the trailer was derivative, but sitting down in the theater and actually watching this, I was shocked by just how much of a direct copy and paste this was. And it's insulting because I think the first one is actually pretty suspenseful and eerily grounded, and this just destroys all of that. And with how similarly it follows the basic template, it may as well be a remake, but I don't know, supposedly director Rennie Harlin has claimed that it is set in the same continuity as the first two, and it's the first chapter in a trilogy. I could care less where this goes. I'll watch part 2 and 3, but I don't have very high hopes for them. Number 7, Borderlands. I know what you're probably thinking right now. Josh, how is this only number 7? Are there really films in 2024 that were worse than this? The answer is yes. Yes, there are. But we're talking about some pretty thin margins. This movie still sucks ass. Borderlands is emblematic of everything wrong with Hollywood adaptations. It has hardly a single commonality with the games aside from a few familiar environments that players will recognize. And the thing is, I don't even have that much experience with the Borderlands game series, and yet I'm still able to identify dozens of things that just don't add up, things that they could have included from the games that they should have and didn't. From the little experience that I do have with Borderlands 3, there's a huge emphasis on weapon variety. The weapons are so huge, and my friends and I were talking about this too. This movie disregards that completely. The worst crime has to be the cast though, right? I mean, as much as I love Cate Blanchett, really? She's the one you picked to play Lilith? I'm not even going to bother touching on the others. They're all bad choices, and this whole movie is dreadfully unfunny. It has such a derivative storyline that, once again, doesn't utilize the lore of the games. Just an all-around shockingly bad film. Number 6, Imaginary. From Jeff Wadlow, the esteemed director of Truth or Dare and Fantasy Island, comes what might be his best film yet. And that's pretty much like pointing out the prettiest looking turd that you've excreted in the last week. Full disclosure, the third act does go kind of bonkers and I almost respect it, but it was definitely a case of too little, too late. Blumhouse just keeps shooting out these cheap, trashy horror films that utilize so many tropes that I'm getting tired of. I mean, this one has it all. A little kid finding an old creepy toy that talks to them and befriends them, and for some reason, said child is never creeped out by the supernatural abilities that this toy possesses. And all this thing really does is morph into a giant, shitty CGI bear that, to the best of my memory, doesn't even kill anyone. Of course, this had to be rated PG-13, so it's totally tame and just irredeemably dull. And sadly, even its best ideas are ripped straight out of Coraline, which is an incredible film, so screw you for stealing from that movie. Number 5, Night Swim. I don't know, guys, maybe the Haunted Pool movie should have remained a short, because when you extend this concept to feature length, it becomes blatantly clear that there's not much you can really do with it. Okay, actually, on second thought, I feel like there is potential in this concept, but instead of making the movie about the haunted pool, the writers turned it into just another haunted house movie with a possessed dad turning pale and chasing after his kids. And as I'm sitting here talking about this film, I'm struggling to recall anything else to even mention, probably because it came out in January of last year. It's been 12 months. How am I supposed to remember anything from this trash? Number 4, Craven the Hunter. Yeah, this is not the first Sony live-action Spider-Man villain-verse movie to be on the list. And unfortunately, it's not the last either. This should really be shown in film schools to teach students how not to edit. I mean, this has to be one of the most scatterbrained productions I've seen all year. And things in this movie, like, they just happen. They rarely make sense, they rarely have any degree of coherence, but they just happen. Horrible special effects, even though it got delayed like 100 times, probably because test screenings went very poorly and they did a bunch of reshoots. I don't know the details. I didn't even have the motivation to actually do a deep dive and understand what went wrong here. But hey, at least Alessandro Nivola makes that weird-ass guttural noise that everyone has been memeing, and plenty of other dumb things in this movie happen that probably could be memed, but surprisingly, unlike Morbius, I don't see many people talking about this film because I don't think anyone bothered to see it. In all seriousness, this just falls flat on every level. Just bad dialogue, bad CG, horrendous acting from everyone except maybe Russell Crowe and Fred Hechinger. Comic book movies have devolved big time, man. Number 3, Afraid. Proof that a film needs to be more than just an idea. Because truth be told, I actually like the concept of this film. It feels relevant. Basically, this family gets to test out a new AI product called Aya, which is like essentially you set up a bunch of security cameras in your house. It can watch you, it can do your bills for you, it can help you parent. I think there's potential in that idea to really explore some interesting themes that are relevant to how we're using AI today and how it might be used in the near future. But unfortunately, the script is just dead on arrival. It's awful, forced dialogue, especially with the daughter when she goes to school. I was like laughing out loud at some of the dialogue because thankfully I was the only one in the theater seeing this crap. Absolutely laughable attempts at horror and jump scares, especially when they start introducing the people that created this product and their sinister agenda. And add to that, the ending of this movie is atrocious and it abruptly cuts things short and gives the audience zero closure. It made me sit back and wonder what the hell the point of any of this was. The silver medal goes to Bagman. And look, this is probably the least relevant and lowest budget film on the list, but Jesus, man, they make dozens of these each year, and they are all clones of one another, and they need to stop. No more Bye Bye Man, no more Bagman. I mean, what's next? The Butthole Man? This film is just a boring, endless pile of cliches, piss-poor jump scares, boring exposition. I love Sam Claflin, but I don't know what the hell he was thinking accepting a role like this. I mean, I'm all for him branching out and exploring some roles in horror films, but come on, man, the script of this movie somehow manages to make even him boring, and that is an unforgivable sin. And that brings us to number 1, the worst film of 2024, which for me is undoubtedly Madam Webb. A train wreck of biblical proportions. And look, I'll say this about Madam Webb, it's probably much more entertaining than the last 3 or 4 films that I've talked about. If you walk into it with the expectation that it's atrocious and you just want to laugh at it, that could be a fun experience, especially if you throw some alcohol in there too. And that is going to make it a guilty pleasure cult film, I'm sure, in the future. But for me, I've never subscribed to the idea that a guilty pleasure movie is actually good. There's a reason that guilty is a part of the name. It's because you're watching an objectively bad movie and your brain knows it, even if you do find it amusingly bad. I wish I was exaggerating, but I cannot believe that this is an actual film released by Sony Pictures in movie theaters with a production budget of $80 million. First of all, the marketing was misleading as shit, tricking audiences into believing that we would be seeing Spider-Women suited up, webbing bad guys, and in actuality, we only see that for about 5 seconds, and it's through these psychic premonitions of another character. It's not even something that's actually happening. The film itself actually has very little action. It's more of a road trip comedy with characters that I could not stand, even if they're portrayed by actors who I generally like. But I think what will make it a guilty pleasure for some people is the brain-dead dialogue. This is genuinely some of the worst that I've heard in years. And here, I'm gonna read a few lines from the film just to give you an idea. At one point, the villain remarks, "I went through a lot of trouble to steal you these tools. Use them better." Just before the credits roll at the end of the film, Madame Webb herself says, "You know the best thing about the future? It hasn't happened yet." And my favorite, and this is just a desecration of a famous line from the Spider-Man films, "When you take on the responsibility, great power will come." I mean, who thought this was a good idea? And just like that, we have finished sifting through the trash and unveiling to you my list of the 15 worst of the worst films of 2024. I know there's a growing controversy in the YouTube film discussion stratosphere about making videos like this, especially since Chris Stuckman decided to stop talking negatively about films that he didn't like in his reviews anymore. And look, I understand making movies is hard, right? And I'm sure a lot of people that worked on the films that I talked about in this video worked very hard, but it doesn't negate the fact that you're allowed to critique art. And I know that I've been pretty harsh on some of these movies, but it's nothing personal against any of the people that worked on these projects. I wish them all the best, and I hope that they make something better in the future. That's gonna do it for this video. As I said before, be sure to let me know what your least favorites were down in the comments. Hit that like button as well as subscribe while you're at it if you want more content like this. I'll catch you guys in the next one. See you later.